i upoznavanje s gospodarstvom. I upoznavanje s gospodarstvom. Naučit ćete pojmove gospodarstvo i ekonomija, glavne ekonomske doktrine, izvorno značenje gospodarstva, ekonomija. Prvi, pojmovi gospodarstvo i ekonomija. Ekonomija je znanstvena disciplina koja proučava kako se društva koriste resursima u proizvodnji dobara i kako ih raspodjeljuju među ljudima ili društvenim skupinama. Ekonomija kao znanost dijeli se na crni krug. Makroekonomiju proučava ekonomske zakonitosti na razini gospodarstva kao cjeline. Dakle, na makrorazini. Makroekonomija, primjerice, proučava državno upravljanje, gospodarenje, cjelokupnim gospodarskim sustavom. Država primjenjuje instrumente makroekonomske politike, prije svega fiskalnu, porezi i monetarnu, optjecaj novca i tečaj valute, politiku. Mikroekonomiju proučava ekonomske zakonitosti na razini gospodarskih subjekata, poduzeća, koji djeluju na tržištu pod utjecajem ponude i potražnje. Dakle, na mikrorazini. Gospodarstvo obuhvaća proizvodnju, raspodjelu, razmjenu i potrošnju kao cjelovit lanac ljudskih djelatnosti koje su usmjerene na zadovoljavanje ljudskih potreba i želja. Drugi, povijesni razvoj gospodarstva i temeljne ekonomske doktrine. Ekonomija, grčki oikos, kuća, domaćinstvo i nomos, zakon, je izvorno u antičkoj Grčkoj označavala upravljanje kućanstvom, odnosno domaćinstvom, koje je skrbilo za podmirenje temeljnih egzistencijalnih potreba. Dakle, za razliku od politike koja je pripadala sferi javnosti i u kojoj su djelovali slobodni građani, ekonomija je bila u sferi privatnosti u kojoj su se zadovoljavale egzistencijalne potrebe. Otuda se za pojam ekonomija u hrvatskome. Za grčkoga filozofa Aristotela, od 384. do 322. godine prije Krista, ekonomija je bila praktična znanost umjeća gospodarenja i nije trebala imati za cilj stjecanje bogatstva. Zauzimao se za razvoj trgovine, ali samo pod uvjetom da ne stvara individualnu korist koja bi promijenila status pojedinaca u društvu i učinila jedne bogatima, a druge siromašnima. Jeziku često rabi riječ gospodarstvo, iako te dvije riječi zapravo ne znače isto. Tijekom stoljeća ekonomija sve više istražuje gospodarske procese na razini čitavoga društva. Postaje sve općenitijom i sve više nastoji dokučiti kako steći bogatstvo, što je suprotno antičkim shvaćanjima o svrsi ekonomije. Puni je zamah u tome smislu ekonomija doživjela u novom vijeku, nakon uspostave modernih država. Tada se, posebice u 18. stoljeću, ekonomija počinje razvijati kao znanost i to u više smjerova i ekonomskih doktrina, u koje ubrajamo 8 važnijih. Prvi, merkantilizam, talijanski mercantile, trgovački, ekonomska doktrina koja se razvijala od 15. do 18. stoljeća, prema kojoj je trgovina glavna gospodarska grana. Za merkantiliste cilj ekonomske politike mora biti rast bogatstva i moći i pojedinaca i država prije svega međunarodnom trgovinom te stjecanjem zlata i srebra. Francuski političar i merkantilist Jean-Baptiste Colbert, od 1619. do 1683. godine, koji je bio ministar financija za vrijeme Luja XIV. Smatrao je da je trgovina presudna za uvećavanje bogatstva i zauzimao se za povećanje izvoza i smanjenje uvoza, čime je Francuska izrasla u kolonijalnu silu. Po njemu je jedan smjer merkantilizma nazvan kolbertizam.
Mercantilism and Colbertism in France by Murray N. Rothbard. In France, which was to become in the 17th century the home par excellence of the despotic nation-state, the promising cloth trade and other commerce and industry in Lyon and the Languedoc region in the south were crippled by the devastating religious wars in the last 4 decades of the 16th century. In addition to the devastation and the killing and emigration of skilled Huguenot craftsmen to England, high taxes to finance the war served to cripple French economic growth. Then the Politika party, riding to power on the promise of ending religious strife, ushered in the unchecked reign of royal absolutism. Crippling regulation of French industry had begun in the late 15th century when the king issued scores of guild charters, conferring the power to control and to set standards of quality in the different occupations upon urban guilds and their officials. The crown conferred cartelizing privileges on the guilds while levying taxes upon them in exchange. A major reason why Lyon had flourished during the 16th century was that it was granted a special exemption from guild rule and guild restrictions. By the end of the 16th century and the religious wars, the old regulations were still in place, ready to be enforced. The new absolute monarchy was ready to enforce them and carry them further. Thus, in 1581, King Henry III ordered all the artisans of France to join and group themselves into guilds, whose orders were to be enforced. All except Parisian and Lyonnese craftsmen were forced to confine their activity to their current towns. In that way, mobility in French industry was brought to an end. In 1597, Henry IV reenacted and strengthened these laws and proceeded to enforce them thoroughly. The result of this network of restriction was the total crippling of economic and industrial growth in France. The typical ploy of preserving standards of quality meant that competition was hobbled, production and imports limited, and prices kept high. It meant, in short, that consumers were not allowed the option of paying less money for lower quality products. State-privileged monopolies grew as well, with similar effects, and upon the guilds and the monopolies the state levied increasing and stifling taxes. Growing inspection fees for quality also exacted a great burden on the French economy. Furthermore, luxury production was particularly subsidized, and the profits of expanding industries diverted to subsidize the weak. Capital accumulation was thereby slowed, and the growth of promising and strong industries crippled. The subsidizing and privileging of luxury industries meant a shift of resources away from cost-cutting innovations in new mass production industries, and towards such areas of high-cost craftsmanship as glass and tapestries. The increasingly powerful French monarchy and aristocracy were large consumers of luxury goods, and were therefore particularly interested in fostering them and maintaining their quality. Price was no great object, since the monarchy and nobility lived off compulsory levies in any case. Thus, in May 1665, the king established monopoly privileges for a group of French lace manufacturers, using the transparently canting argument that this was done to prevent the export of money and to give employment to the people. Actually, the point was to prohibit anyone other than the privileged licensees from making lace, in return for hefty fees paid to the crown. Domestic cartels are worthless if the consumer is allowed to buy cheaper substitutes from abroad, and so protective tariffs were levied on imported lace. But apparently smuggling abounded, and so in 1667 the government made enforcement easier by prohibiting all foreign lace whatsoever. In addition, to prevent unlicensed competition, it was necessary for the French crown to prohibit any lace work at home, and to force all lace work to occur at fixed, visible points of manufacture. Thus, as the Finance and Commerce Minister and General Economic Czar, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, wrote to a government lace supervisor, "I beg you to note with care that no girl must be allowed to work at the home of her parents, and that you must oblige them all to go to the house of the manufacturers." Perhaps the most important of the numerous mercantile restrictions on the French economy imposed in the 17th century was the enforcing of quality standards on production and trade. This tended to mean a freezing of the French economy at the level of the early or mid-17th century. That coerced freeze effectively hobbled or even prevented the innovation, new products, new technologies, new methods of handling production and exchange, so necessary to economic and industrial development. One example was the loom, invented in the early 17th century, at first used principally for the production of the luxury item, silk stockings. When looms began to be applied to relatively mass consumption woolen and linen goods, the hand knitters balked at the efficient competition and persuaded Colbert in 1680 to outlaw the use of the loom on any article except silk. Fortunately, in the case of the loom, the excluded woolen and linen manufacturers were politically powerful enough to get the prohibition repealed 4 years later, and to get themselves included in the protectionist cartelist system of advantage. All these tendencies of French mercantilism reached a climax in the era of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, 1619 to 1683, so much so that he gave the name Colbertism to the most hypertrophied embodiment of mercantilism. The son of a merchant born at Reims, Colbert early in life joined the French central bureaucracy. By 1651, he had become a leading bureaucrat in the service of the crown, and from 1661 to his death, 22 years later, Colbert was the virtual economic czar, absorbing such offices as Superintendent of Finance, of Commerce, and Secretary of State, under the great Sun King, that epitome of absolutist despotism, Louis XIV. Colbert engaged in a virtual orgy of grants of monopoly, subsidies of luxury, and cartelizing privilege, and built up a mighty system of central bureaucracy, of officials known as intendants, to enforce the network of controls and regulations. He also created a formidable system of inspections, marks, and measurements to be able to identify all those straying from the detailed list of state regulations. The intendants employed a network of spies and informers to ferret out all violations of the cartel restrictions and regulations. In the classic mode of spies everywhere, they also spied on each other, including the intendants themselves. Penalties for violations ranged from confiscation and destruction of the inferior production to heavy fines, public mockery, and deprivation of one's license to stay in business. As the major historian of mercantilism summed up French enforcement, no measure of control was considered too severe where it served to secure the greatest possible respect for the regulations. Two of the most extreme examples of the suppression of innovation in France occurred shortly after the death of Colbert during the lengthy reign of Louis XIV. Button-making in France had been controlled by various guilds, depending on the material used, the most important part belonging to the Cord and Button Makers Guild, who made cord buttons by hand. By the 1690s, tailors and dealers launched the innovation of weaving buttons from the material used in the garment. The outrage of the inefficient hand button makers brought the state leaping to their defense. In the late 1690s, fines were imposed on the production, sale, and even the wearing of the new buttons, and the fines were continually increased. The local guild wardens even obtained the right to search people's houses and to arrest anyone in the street who wore the evil and illegal buttons. In a few years, however, the state and the hand button makers had to give up the fight, since everyone in France was using the new buttons. More important in stunting France's industrial growth was the disastrous prohibition of the popular new cloth, printed calicos. Cotton textiles were not yet of supreme importance in this era, but cottons were to be the spark of the Industrial Revolution in 18th century England. France's strictly enforced policy made sure that cottons would not be flourishing there. The new cloth, printed calicos, began to be imported from India in the 1660s and became highly popular, useful for an inexpensive mass market as well as for high fashion. As a result, calico printing was launched in France. By the 1680s, the indignant woolen, cloth, silk, and linen industries all complained to the state of unfair competition by the highly popular upstart. The printed colors were readily outcompeting the older cloths, and so the French state responded in 1686 by total prohibition of printed calicos, their import or their domestic production. In 1700, the French government went all the way, an absolute ban on every aspect of calicos, including their use in consumption. Government spies had a hysterical field day, peering into coaches and private houses and reporting that the governess of the Marquis de Cormoy had been seen at her window clothed in calico of a white background with big red flowers, almost new, or that the wife of a lemonade seller had been seen in her shop in a casquin of calico. Literally thousands of Frenchmen died in the calico struggles, either being executed for wearing calicos or in armed raids against calico users. Calicos were so popular, however, especially among French ladies, that the fight was eventually lost, even though the prohibition stayed on the books until the late 18th century. The smuggling of calicos simply could not be stopped, but it was, of course, easier to enforce the prohibition against domestic calico manufacture than against the entire French consuming population, and so the result of the near century of prohibition was to put a total stop to any domestic calico printing industry in France. The calico entrepreneurs and skilled craftsmen, many of them Huguenots oppressed by the French state, emigrated to Holland and England, strengthening the calico industry in those countries. Furthermore, pervasive maximum wage controls discouraged workers from moving or, in particular, entering industry, and tended to keep workers on the farm. Apprenticeship requirements of 3 or 4 years greatly restricted labor mobility and prevented entrance into crafts. Each master was limited to 1 or 2 apprentices, thereby preventing the growth of any single firm. Before Colbert, most French revenue came from taxation, but grants of monopoly proliferated so much during the Colbert regime to try to pay for swelling expenditures that monopoly grant revenue came to more than 1/2 of all state income. Most onerous and strictly enforced was the government's salt monopoly. Salt producers were required to sell all salt produced to certain royal storehouses at fixed prices. The consumers were then forced to purchase salt and to expand state income and deprive smugglers of revenue to purchase a fixed amount at 4 times the free market price and divide it among the inhabitants. Despite the enormous increase in monopoly grant revenue, taxes rose greatly in France as well. The land tax, or taille réelle, was the single largest source of revenue for the state, and in the early part of his regime, Colbert tried to expand the burden of the taille still further. But the taille was hampered by a network of exemptions, especially including all the nobility. Colbert tried his best to spy on the exempt, to ferret out false nobles, and to stop the network of bribes of the tax collectors. An attempt to lower the taille slightly and greatly to increase the aides, indirect internal taxes at wholesale and retail, particularly on beverages, came a cropper on the bribery and corruption of the tax farmers. And then there was the gabelle, tax on salt, revenue from which rose tenfold in real terms between the early 16th and mid-17th centuries. During the Colbert era, gabelle revenues rose not so much from an increase in tax rates as from the tightening of enforcement of the existing steep taxes. The land and consumption taxes fell heavily upon the poor and upon the middle class, gravely crippling saving and investment, especially as we have seen in the mass production industries. The parlous state of the French economy may be seen by the fact that in 1640, just as King Charles I of England was facing a successful revolution, largely brought about by his imposition of high taxes, the French crown was collecting 3 to 4 times as much taxes per capita as did King Charles. As a result of all these factors, even though the population of France was 6 times that of England during the 16th century, and its early industrial development had seemed promising, French absolutism and strictly enforced mercantilism managed to put that country out of the running as a leading nation in industrial or economic growth.
Moram na posao. Jer to želim. Moram staviti djecu na spavanje. Bila jednom jedna. Jer to želim. Moram se obrijati. Jer to želim. Gillette Pro Glide s novom razinom oštrine za temeljito brijanje u jednom potezu u kojem ćete uživati. Gillette, jer to želim.
Oftalmologiju u Klaićevoj smo obnovili i uredili. Idemo malim koracima do velikih promjena.
1815, Napoleon has been defeated. During his
Fiziokracija. Drugi. Fiziokracija. Grč. Fizis. Priroda i kratos. Vladati. Ekonomska doktrina koja je nastala u 18. stoljeću prema kojoj je poljoprivreda glavna gospodarska grana. Fiziokrati su smatrali da jedino zemlja i njezino iskorištavanje, najviše kroz poljoprivredu, mogu stvoriti višak vrijednosti. Dobit. Točka. Fiziokracija se temeljila na ideji prirodnih zakonitosti koja je bila iskazana parolom laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Franz, pustite da stvari idu svojim tijekom, kojom su fiziokrati tražili slobodu u gospodarskim aktivnostima, prije svega poduzetništvu, bez uplitanja države. Kasnije je tu krilaticu prihvatila doktrina klasične ekonomije. Francuski ekonomist fiziokrat Francois Quesnay od 1694. do 1774. godine postavio je temelje fiziokratskoj doktrini. Smatrao je da gospodarstvom države upravljaju prirodni zakoni koji trebaju djelovati u potpunoj slobodi od državne politike. Klasična ekonomija. 3. Klasična ekonomija. Politička ekonomija. Ekonomska doktrina koja je nastala u 18. stoljeću u Velikoj Britaniji, prema kojoj su rad i podjela rada temeljna gospodarska aktivnost. Temeljila se na prirodnim zakonitostima odvijanja gospodarske aktivnosti, slobodi trgovine i poduzetništva. Time je utemeljen ekonomski liberalizam koji podrazumijeva slobodnu tržišnu aktivnost bez uplitanja države. Škotski filozof i ekonomist Adam Smith od 1723. do 1790. godine. Utemeljitelj je klasične ekonomije i ekonomskog liberalizma. Napisao je prvo sustavno ekonomsko djelo Bogatstvo naroda 1776. godine, kojim je postavio počela moderne ekonomske znanosti. Zauzimao se za raskid s proteklim ekonomskim doktrinama i smatrao kako se ekonomija treba uspostaviti kao politička ekonomija. To znači da treba djelovati u smjeru poticanja rasta, bogatstva i blagostanja naroda. Socijalistička ekonomija. 4. Socijalistička ekonomija, ekonomska doktrina koja se stvarala od 18. do 20. stoljeća. Smatrala je da ekonomski liberalizam s temeljnom idejom slobodnoga tržišta ne može jamčiti stabilnost ekonomskoga sustava. Zbog toga se zauzimala za plansko upravljanje gospodarstvom putem državnog intervencionizma, umjesto isključivo tržišnih načela. Njemački filozof, ekonomist i sociolog Karl Marx od 1818. do 1883. godine. Utemeljitelj je socijalističke ekonomije. Prikazao je cjelovit sustav funkcioniranja kapitalističke ekonomije koju je kritizirao. Smatrao je da je kapitalistička ekonomija, ekonomski liberalizam, utemeljena na izrabljivanju radničke klase jer su sredstva za proizvodnju u rukama kapitalističke klase. Kapitalista, koja nepravedno prisvaja višak proizvodnje. Profit, koji bi trebao pripasti onima koji rade, radnicima. Neoklasična ekonomija. 5. Neoklasična ekonomija, ekonomska doktrina koja je nastala u 19. stoljeću, prema kojoj je slobodno tržište samo od sebe mehanizam opće ekonomske ravnoteže, uz optimum proizvodnje i potrošnje. Britanski matematičar i ekonomist William Stanley Evans od 1835. do 1882. godine. Jedan je od utemeljitelja neoklasične ekonomije. Smatrao je da se vrijednost u ekonomiji, prije svega cijena, izvodi iz korisnosti. Pojednostavljeno, to znači koliko je određeno dobro korisno za nekoga, toliko raste ili se smanjuje njegova cijena. Ekonomija blagostanja. 6. Ekonomija blagostanja, ekonomska doktrina nastala u 20. stoljeću, prema kojoj cilj gospodarske aktivnosti jest kako ostvariti opće blagostanje ljudi. Blagostanje ovisi o veličini nacionalnog dohotka i njegovoj raspodjeli u društvu. Što je veći nacionalni dohodak, to je veće opće blagostanje. Britanski ekonomist Arthur Cecil Pigou od 1877. do 1959. godine. Utemeljitelj je ekonomije blagostanja. Smatrao je da se blagostanje mjeri ukupnim zbrojem zadovoljstava što ih pojedinac doživljava uporabom raspoložive količine dobara. Keynesijanska ekonomija. 7. Keynesijanska ekonomija. Prema J. M. Keynesu, ekonomska doktrina koja je nastala 1930. godina, prema kojoj tržište samo od sebe ne jamči stabilnost, stoga je potrebna državna intervencija. Intervencionizam, kako bi ispravila njegove nedostatke. Britanski ekonomist John Maynard Keynes, od 1883. do 1946. godine. Zauzimao se za aktivnu ulogu države kako bi se njezinim interveniranjem u ekonomiju regulirali i stabilizirali potražnja, investicije, rashodi i prihodi. Neoliberalna ekonomija. 8. Neoliberalna ekonomija je ekonomska doktrina nastala početkom 1970. godina pod utjecajem britanske premijerke Margaret Thatcher i američkoga predsjednika Ronalda Reagana. Temelji se na prijašnjim idejama ekonomskog liberalizma. Privatno vlasništvo, potpuna sloboda tržišta, odsutnost državnog intervencionizma i smanjenje javnih rashoda. Nastala je nasuprot ekonomiji blagostanja i keynesijanskoj ekonomiji. Američki ekonomist Milton Friedman od 1912. do 2006. godine. Jedan je od teoretičara neoliberalne ekonomije kojoj je postavio temelje u monetarnoj teoriji. Monetarizam. Protivio se državnome intervencionizmu, osobito uplitanju države koja bi promicala politiku blagostanja. Smatrao je da je u gospodarstvu najvažnija kontrola novčanih tokova. Razmisli koja ekonomska doktrina danas prevladava u svijetu i u razredu raspravite zbog čega je to tako. Također, razmislite i raspravite o tome razlikuju li se po tom pitanju europske države od ostatka svijeta. Pitanja za provjeru znanja. 1. Što je ekonomija, a što gospodarstvo? 2. Kako se dijeli ekonomija kao znanost? 3. Navedi temeljne ekonomske doktrine i na čemu se svaka od njih temelji. 4. Objasni značenje parole laissez-faire, laissez-passer. 5. Što za Adama Smitha znači politička ekonomija?